You notice that sometimes, I keep track of all the things that we read, since we don't read according to the lectionary of the Bible, but we choose our passages. So I keep track of all the things we read, and sometimes we'll encounter things that we have not read in several years, and sometimes we read the same things over and over and over again because they're so important to our story. And so today we read again that story from the Gospel of Matthew about the final prayer of Jesus and about that time that he had in the garden. We also read from 1 Corinthians 12, or 2 Corinthians 12, which we have read several times in the last couple of years. And perhaps one of the stories that we know best. Oh, you can leave up that picture for me. That's great, thank you. The story of the Good Samaritan. This is Vincent van Gogh's depiction of the Good Samaritan. And this is one of those stories that most of us, if we grew up in the church, first learned in Sunday school. And it's likely, because of the way church works, that we've heard it at least once a year since then. And so we hear it, we know it. The problem is, our familiarity with it makes us overlook what's shocking about it, makes us overlook what's important about it. So I want to draw back from the story a little bit, and I want you to think about broadly your experience with the Bible. Think about the themes that have come out in the Bible for you, about what is most important as you read the Bible over and over again. What are some of the themes that reoccur in the Bible as most important? Love your neighbor. Love, right? So if you ever hear pastor preach, you're going to hear love over and over and over again. Absolutely. I think that's probably the top one. What are some of the others? Focus on the most vulnerable, the marginalized. What else? Forgiveness. Absolutely. What else? Generosity. So I was reading the Bible, again, as pastors do, right? This is all I do. I just read the Bible, right? I sit around, and Megan watches TV and does sinful things, and pastor is good and pious and prays and reads the Bible. That's just what I do. So I've been rereading the Bible again in the last year, as I do, and a theme popped up to me that we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. And that theme that shows up again and again, which I think is perhaps only second to love as the most important in Scripture, is peace. Peace. I did a word study this week, and the word peace showed up some 360 times in the Bible. Just peace in the English translation, not even shalom or eirene, the words underneath it in the Greek, would show up more and more often. Because the word is so common that Isaac is walking along, and Isaac walks up to Esau, or Jacob walks up to Esau, and Jacob says, "Shalom? Is it peace?" And Esau says, "Shalom." And it's the greeting. You encounter this when you go to the Middle East. You walk up to somebody and you don't first say, "Hello, how are you doing?" You say, "Salam alaikum." Peace to you. As-alaikum salam. And also with you. That's the greeting. Because it's so foundational to who we are called to be as people of faith. Peace is the foundation. It's why it's a part of every service, and we share the peace. Not because it's a really nice time to say hello and ask how everybody's week is. Because we really are invited to share peace with one another. And so we're going to talk over the next 3 weeks about this idea of peace in the Bible. Next week, we'll talk more specifically about peace itself. So tune in next time, same Jesus channel. But this week, I want to talk about peace through the lens of this story of the Good Samaritan. Because I think that this is ultimately a story about peace, at least as it's seen through Jesus, right? Because peace can mean a number of different things. It can mean just getting along. It can mean the absence of violence. It can mean you're not currently at war, and so you're at peace. But I think for Jesus in the New Testament, that peace is something more. And he shows it here in this story. Now, when we have read this story, we've often focused on that question, what does it mean to love our neighbor? Because that's the question that Jesus is answering, right? Makes sense. Who is my neighbor? And we've talked about how Samaritans and Jews, right, they don't get along. It's an old story. It goes back to the year 720 BC. The Assyrians come in, they conquer the northern half of Israel, and they take them away. And so the northern half of Israel has a slightly different religion than the southern half of Israel. They're Jewish, but they're Jewish, right? They are similar to the Jews in the south, and they worship the God Yahweh, the God of Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they do it in a different way, in different places, and they intermarried with the Assyrians and the Persians and the other people who came through there. And so we don't like them. But it's kind of like, look, I know you all get along with your families. But the fact is, hate doesn't show up anywhere more powerfully than it does in families sometimes, right? Because it's easier to just let it slide when people we don't love do something stupid. But when people we love do something we disagree with, we're more likely to get angry about it. And then remember it. Year after year after year after year, right? Family conflicts are the worst. They're intractable. They're hard to pull apart. The story of the Samaritans and the Jews is a family conflict. It's a fight among cousins. And it got to the degree where if you're traveling from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south, there's a direct line. You don't take that because it goes through Samaria. So you go around Samaria so that you don't have to talk to any of those people. It's a bad neighborhood. Thugs and criminals live there, right? So you go around it. And a Samaritan, if a Samaritan or a Jew sees a Samaritan on the road, they might clutch their purse a little more tightly and cross over to the other side of the road. They certainly wouldn't sit down and eat with them. And they certainly wouldn't stop and talk to them. That's those people. And so we talk about how extraordinary it is that this Samaritan does the loving thing towards somebody who actively hates him. But we miss, I think, what happened to this guy on the road. Why is he in this condition? Because he got robbed. So if you see somebody down a dark alley and you're walking on the main road and they got mugged down the dark alley, what's likely to happen to you down the dark alley? You're likely to get mugged. This was a scary place, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Those of you who traveled with me to the Holy Land, there ain't nothing between Jerusalem and Jericho but sand and hills and blind corners because it's mountainous. And so you never know what's around the next corner. You never know what's over the next hill, which meant it was the perfect place. It was the equivalent of an ancient Middle Eastern dark alley. It was the perfect place to lie in wait and hijack a pilgrim going to or from Jerusalem. Somebody who had their laptop sitting out in the front seat of their car, right? Who left their luggage in the front seat of the car when they went into the hotel, Right? It was the perfect kind of place for that. So if you're traveling through a place like that, if you're traveling through a place where there's likely to be carjackings, muggings, stolen cars, what should you not do? Stop! That's the part we miss. Not just that the Samaritan did the loving thing, but that he did the risky thing. That in loving his neighbor, this Samaritan put himself at risk, made himself vulnerable. We don't love vulnerability in our world. We don't love people who show themselves to be weak, who expose themselves to the potential of getting taken advantage of. Right? Be smart. Stand up for yourself. Don't put yourself in bad situations. Make good decisions. Don't go through that neighborhood. You might want to avoid those people. Don't stop and help. You might put yourself in danger. But love is vulnerable. And love is the heart of peace. Right? You cannot have peace with your neighbor whom you don't love. Acting nonviolently. The key image of nonviolence that I think of is I think of Montgomery in 1964 with Bull Connor putting the hoses and the dogs on the protesters coming out of the 16th Street Baptist Church, right? By acting peacefully, those protesters put themselves in harm's way. They were likely to be arrested, attacked by dogs, sprayed with hoses, beaten up. Love is vulnerable. Every time you love someone, you put yourself at risk. Yeah? Because when you show someone your inner self, they could abuse that. They could use that to their own advantage. They could tell someone your deepest, darkest secrets. They could, when I went to premarital counseling all those many years ago, the one thing that stuck with me is the person I was talking to said, every relationship, every person has a big red button. A thing you can say to them that you know will blow up the conversation. And if you love someone, they know what your big red button is. To be in a relationship is to trust that the person you are with will not hit that big red button. Right? Because they know what it is. They know how to hurt you. They love you. To love is to expose ourselves to vulnerability. So when he is asked, what does it mean to love our neighbor? Jesus tells this story about somebody who not only loves unexpectedly, but loves with great risk, loves with great courage. We're talking on Tuesday about Bishop Buddy, and she said this, right? So when Jesus asks, who was the one who was a neighbor? What does the lawyer answer? The one who showed compassion, the one who showed mercy. When Bishop Buddy preached at the service of prayer on the day of the inauguration, she said, show mercy. For that, she has received death threats, threats to her job. There is a bill going through Congress to censure her because she said, show mercy. In this world, it is risky to love our neighbor. It is dangerous to show love, not just in the way that stopping in a dark alley is dangerous, but in a way that this world doesn't want us to be compassionate and merciful and loving. This world doesn't want you to be compassionate and loving and merciful. This world wants you to say, what's best for me? How do I protect myself and my interests? The gospel calls us to compassion, to vulnerability. The flip side of vulnerability, right? And so if vulnerability is always risky, if love is always risky, the flip side is, what's happened in your life when you've been really vulnerable with people? That's also where real love comes from. When you know the person you're with, your neighbor, your friends. My best friends are the ones who know my darkest stories. My best friends who love me the best are the ones who know that I'm not actually a pious person who just sits and reads the Bible all day. Right? Vulnerability also leads to real love. I suspect, I would love to be wrong, okay? I would love to be wrong. I suspect that it is going to only become more and more risky to be compassionate and merciful as people of faith in the years ahead. I suspect that the voices of anger and defensiveness and violence are only going to escalate, which means we need to be even more committed to mercy and compassion and vulnerable love of our neighbor. Who was a neighbor to the man who was set upon by thieves? The one who took a risk for his neighbor.